In this lesson we're going to be looking at JSX in a little bit more detail. So by the end of this lesson we will have created our first project using a React template on Code Sandbox. You'd have a good idea about how React works in that template, and also have some experience in writing JSX specifically around using variables and also some conditional operators. So let's create a sandbox. And we want to use the React by Code Sandbox template. Now this is going to generate a few files for us, and I'm just going to talk you through those folders and files first of all before we actually start writing in some code. So here we go, we've got a public folder with an index.html file. Then we've got an src folder with a few different files, and then we've got our package.json. So this is actually developing in a Node.js environment, which is why we have a package.json created. And when we come on to actually setting up your local environment and using create React app, I'm going to talk you through this file in a little bit more detail, but for now let's just focus on the basics of React. So I'm also going to remove some of these files. I'm going to remove app.js, I'm going to remove styles.css, and I'm going to clear out index.js. So we just have an src folder and an index.js file of just blank, no JavaScript, just a blank file. So in index.html, I'm going to remove some of the comments here, so on these lines 8 to 11, and down here, and down here, just to show you on quite clearly the structure of this file. Now it is extremely simple. We've got an HTML file with some tags in the head tags. We've got our React app title, no JavaScript at all, and it's got one div with an ID of root. Now this is very common and is also best practice when building React documents, and we will see this when we come on to use create React app as mentioned. It'll be the same structure. So there's only one div with an ID of root, and all our React code is going to be rendering in this div. Okay, so let's actually render some code into that div. So as I said, we're using React here in a Node.js environment, and how we'd load modules is by using the require function. So I'm going to set a variable called React and set that equal to require React and var React DOM and require React DOM, and this needs to be a small case. So we're loading our React and React DOM modules from our React and React DOM dependencies. So you'll see the dependencies already added here, and that'll match what's in our package.json file. So the dependencies have been preloaded because we're using the React template. Now there is no node modules folder here with these libraries in. That's just hidden, but the dependencies are there in this project. And in the last lesson we covered how to actually render something. So we need to use the render method. So React DOM.render, and as we know how this works is you can type what it is you want to render and then a comma followed by where you want to render it. So let's write some JSX and let's render a div with the string hello world. And we want to render that attached to our root div in our HTML file. So we can use access to DOM, so use the keyword document dot get element by ID. So we want to get the ID, and that ID is root. Okay, nice, and you can see that has now created string hello world in our document. Now this is syntax that we can actually change. We can actually use ES16 import syntax instead of just requiring every time. It's slightly simpler, and you'll also see it on the React code you're looking at. So Babel will actually compile our import statements down to this code here. So if you go to babel.js.io, I can just show you very quickly, and on try it out, you can see I've already typed this in previously. So import of React DOM changes to require React DOM. So this is our ES 2016 syntax, and it compiles it down to plain JavaScript that the browser can understand, and that plain JavaScript is here using is that require syntax. So we can actually import React from React and import React DOM from React DOM, and nothing's going to change. We haven't broken our project, everything is working nicely as expected. Okay, so one thing to note about this render method, that we can't have multiple divs alongside each other. So if I was going to copy this and just paste that in there, then this is actually not valid and is going to break. So if I refresh this now, we should have some problems, some errors. Yeah, and the whole thing's crashed. So there's adjacent JSX elements. So with JSX, we need to only have one root div. So the way we can work around this is by having, basically nesting this into a top level div. So this is valid, and you can see that working fine. So we can have a div, and then even maybe a H1 tags with hello world. Now, what if we actually want to write some variables in JSX? How would we go about doing that? So let me show you. So I'm going to create two variables, one called app, and set that to a string of click starter, and the second one called topic, and set that to hypercube. So this is a topic which we're going to be covering in a future lesson coming up. And the way we'd actually use these variables in our JSX is by using curly braces. So let's remove world and just replace it with two curly braces, and we're actually going to use template literals, and I'll put a link in the description of this video to more information on that on MDN docs to actually render this variable, render this string. So we need to use backticks, and then a dollar curly braces again, and then the name of the variable, so app. And then we've got hello click starter. And we can add a second one for topic, and then we've got hello click starter hypercube. So we're able to render those variables in our JSX. And we can do the same with numbers. So I'm going to add a paragraph tag, and let's just create a random number just to show you how we can also use numbers. And again, curly braces and math.floor, and I'm just going to access a random number and multiply it by 10, and then we got a random number also appearing, and refreshing this will change that number to a different random one. Okay, great. So now you've learned how to write both strings and numbers in JSX through variables. We can also start looking at some conditional operators. So extremely common in your apps. You're going to be rendering different things depending on certain selections or depending on what the user is doing. So let's add a variable called bool for boolean and set that to true. Now there's a couple of ways we can do this. So we can just we need to first evaluate this variable, and you can use double ampersands, and you can see that's worked. Now what this is doing is it's evaluating this, and if true, render this string. If this is false, then just do nothing, just ignore it. So if I set this to false, you can see that has been removed and we've just got a hello. Now, what we could also do, what if we wanted to render something instead of app topic, depending on this variable? Well, we can also evaluate using a question mark. So if true, render this, and then colon for the alternate. So if this is false, we can just type the string ball is false. And let me set this to false, and then we've rendered hello, ball is false. Okay. So notice no if-else statements here. We will be covering those in a future lesson, but this is the quickest and easiest way of doing conditional rendering in our JSX, and we will cover those more complex rendering requirements in future lessons. Okay, so that's all I had planned for this lesson. So again, a nice gentle introduction. We've created a React template and we've rendered some variables in our browser. And in the next lesson, I'm actually going to test your knowledge, and you're going to be creating just 3 simple KPI objects based on what we've learnt in this lesson.